Hello everyone, I hope you're doing right. Today we're talking about Hatred Assassin. It is the dot spec that you're going to see doing a whole bunch of damage right now, which is very, very fun. It's a good time. Let's talk about it. Brief disclaimer as usual, I'm not an expert in this spec, I'm just a nerd that plays a lot of SWTOR. If you have any recommendations for your fellow players, you can leave them down in the comments below. I'm sure they would appreciate it. But let's jump right into things. So for your tertiary stats, you want to get 110% accuracy in PvE, and then as little accuracy as possible in PvE or PvP. We do a whole lot of yellow damage in this spec, so you don't really need a lot of accuracy. For your alacrity, you want to get to like 7.2% alacrity. That should compensate for most of your lag issues. And then just dump the rest into critical. We want as much crit as humanly possible in this spec. For our tats, we're going to take 2 times trouble. Creeping Terror will take every time you use Assassinate, which is very, very nice. And then every time that you use a melee ability, it has a 50% chance to take extra damage. It's a phenomenal tactical, does a whole boatload of damage for us, and we love to see it. We're also going to take the Force Training Pack, which is going to give us a flat 3% melee and force attack damage increase. It's free damage. There's not much to think about it. Finally, we take the Dynamic Force Package here, which is going to decrease the cooldown of Recklessness by 15 seconds, which is just very, very useful. Recklessness is a very useful ability to us. For our combat style, this is what I personally take. Deadly Field is going to give us extra death fields, which is pretty darn fantastic. It's also going to give us extra death fields every time you use your Recklessness, which is very big part of our rotation. I take Overload here because I'm a bad person, but if you're leveling, you can take like Maul Spike if you really want to. Moving the chain here, I take Befall, which is going to increase the damage or the critical chance of our periodic effects every time you use Eradicate, which is very, very nice. Maliciousness here is just a flat extra 20% damage. It stacks 10% per stack, but it stacks twice, so it's a very useful ability. Phantomless Form here is very, very nice, especially in both PvE and PvP. There's a lot of AoE spam going on in PvP at the moment, and AoE DR is always useful in PvE. Force Phase is what I like to use personally, but if you want to, you can take like Shroud or Lambast, kind of depending on your fight. Lambast is going to be more fun for you AoE spammers, but personally I take Phase because getting rooted stinks as a melee class, and there's a lot of roots going around in SWTOR right now. Force Shroud is what I find the most useful in most fights and in PvP. You can take Whirlwind if you really want to. Some fights will make you take it like Huntmaster in PvE, but for the most part, I find the most utility out of Force Shroud. And then take Reaper's Rush in PvE. It's going to be a massive part of our rotation. It's going to give you free Assassinate, which is pretty darn nice. But in PvP, if you want to, you can always take Shroud of Madness for the extra Cloak and Force Shroud. So those are our utilities so far. Let's talk about actually doing damage. Hatred is a damage over time spec. That means when you use some of our abilities, they're not going to do a whole lot of damage at first. So you can see here, if I just use our Creeping Terror, it's going to do like 4k damage at first. That's not a lot of damage. However, over time, the ability will actually tick for more damage. You can see here, looking at the target, you can see how much longer your dots have to tick by following the little icon right here. And then every time you see those dots on the target, you know that you're doing your damage. We have 3 of these dots, the first of which we've already talked about, which is Creeping Terror. Creeping Terror will root the target for 2 seconds and do like 35,000 damage over the course of the next 18 seconds. It's pretty darn nice. We want to make sure Creeping Terror is on the target as much as possible. In the same vein, Discharge just does flat extra damage. It does like 40k damage in the next 18 seconds. That's a lot of damage. We want to make sure we have our Discharge on the target as much as humanly possible. Additionally, we have our Eradicate here. Now, the other 2 abilities you can kind of spam as much as you want, right? They don't go on cooldown. They don't consume much force. Eradicate does have a cooldown, though, but for good reason, because it does like 15k damage in the opener, and then it's going to do an extra 30k damage over the next 6 seconds, which is a boatload of damage. But you can only use it once every 20 seconds. You can actually shorten that cooldown. We'll talk about that in a quick second here. However, for right now, you just need to know that you can't just be spamming your Eradicate like you can with the other 2. Now, you may have noticed as our dots were ticking on the target here that our Assassinate has started to glow. This is because every time our dots tick on the target, there is a 30% chance that your dots will activate your Assassinate so you can use it for free. Assassinate usually is only usable on targets below 30% health, but because of this little handy utility, we can use it pretty frequently throughout our rotation. Every 9 seconds or so, it should start glowing. If it's glowing, you should probably hit it. That's kind of the rule of SWTOR. But this is how you get your free Assassinates, just by applying your dots. You may have noticed something else happened here. So when we were using our dots in the target, we applied all of our Eradicates, etc., etc. and now Assassinate has started to glow. Every time you hit the target with a melee attack while your discharge is on the target, Eradicate will come off a cooldown once every 9 seconds. So it's not every time, but every 9 seconds when you hit a target that has your dots rolling on it, your Eradicate's cooldown will come off a cooldown. So if we start applying our dots again, apply our dots, apply our dots, apply our dots, and then smash the target with a melee attack, you can see that Eradicate cooldown disappears. That way you can spam it more often than the 22 seconds that it promotes. So those are the first couple of interactions. Apply your dots to the target. Dots will activate your Assassinate. Hitting a target with your dots is going to reduce the cooldown of your Eradicate. Let's talk about another interaction here of Death Field. Death Field, when applied to the target, will leave these little stacks of Death Mark. Death Mark will just flat increase the damage of your dots by 15%. It's pretty darn nice. Anytime you see your death marks on the target, just know that your dots are hitting for significantly harder than they would be otherwise. It's a great way to boost the extra damage of those dots, especially our Eradicate dots. We've talked about a lot so far. Let's talk about a couple more abilities here. Thrash is useful when you're leveling, but when you get to max level and you get the tactical of 2 times trouble, Thrash actually doesn't do that much damage. It's kind of just a force drain. So unfortunately, we kind of leave Thrash behind once you're done leveling. But if you're leveling, you have no other buttons to hit, perfectly fine to hit Thrash. You'll do a fair bit of damage with it. Our Leeching Strike is a fine ability. It hits target once, and then for all the damage that you do to the target, it will heal you for it. So it's more of a utility ability than anything else. So for example, if I hit the target here, boop, you can see here I did 12k damage to the target and heal me for 12k. It's a great way to kind of sustain your health if you find yourself falling a little bit low, especially in like PvP when you might not always have a healer on you. It's a great way to preserve your health bar just a little bit by boop. Let me just heal myself for 20k real quick. It's not much, but it beats a poke in the eye. You know, hard to complain about that. And finally, we have our Saber Strike. Now, because of our tactical, Saber Strike has a 50% chance to tick our Creeping Terror every time we hit the target. And we hit the target 3 times using our Saber Strike. Additionally, Saber Strike does not consume any force, which is a great way to help manage our force, which is very, very useful to us. We don't have a lot of force problems in Hatred, especially because the force is consistently generating. It's not like if you run out of force, it's going to completely destroy your force generation. If you run out of force, it regenerates pretty quickly. Just like wait 2 seconds and you should be fine. However, by using Saber Strike, we consume no force, and it's a great little ability. It takes our dots, and which will also hopefully turn off your Eradicate, which is pretty darn fantastic. So let's walk through the interaction one more time to make sure that we are all on the same page here. So dots do damage to the target over time. They will also make your Assassinate glow. Using a melee ability when your dots on the target will reduce the cooldown of your Eradicate, which means you can smash it again and do all that damage all over again. Additionally, Death Field is a little AoE ability here that you can apply to the target to leave these little death marks onto the target, which is going to increase the damage of your dots. And finally, hitting the target with Saber Strike is going to tick your Creeping Terror up to 3 times. It's only a 50% chance, so you have to win a couple point flips here, but it will do a fair bit of damage. All right. Those are all of our primary damaging abilities here. There is one more ability that we should really be talking about. That is our Recklessness here. Recklessness will give you free crits, which is pretty darn nice. And additionally, we will actually reset all the cooldowns that we have on the target right now. So, for example, if I have all these abilities and put them on cooldowns, so I'm going to use my Eradicate, I'm going to use my Death Field, I'm going to use my Leeching Strike. If I have these abilities all on cooldown and use my Recklessness again, you can see my Leeching Strike, Eradicate, and Death Field all popped back up and are ready to rock and roll once more, on top of them being critically enabled. It's a very nice little ability. Additionally, anytime you do critical damage to the target, the cooldown of Recklessness will be decreased. So I know right now it says like, oh, it's like a 1.20 second cooldown, or 1 minute and 20 second cooldown. It's actually not, because every time you critically hit on the target, the cooldown of Recklessness will be decreased, which is why we can have Recklessness up every like 18 seconds ago if we get lucky with our crits. Okay, that's a lot of interactions. We have one more interaction, then we'll build a rotation, then we'll call it a day. The last interaction comes out of our Boop, 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 boop. Our combat style here of Reaper's Rush. Reaper's Rush means that every time you use our Phantom Stride, Assassinate will be usable onto the target. It's a free way to get more Assassinates. Assassinates do a lot more damage than our Saber Strikes do. So it's free extra ways to get those Assassinates because Assassinates can only proc once every 9 seconds or so. So it's a free way to get more Assassinates. Love to see it. It's just free Assassinates. Great. So every time you use your jump and or your Phantom Stride, you'll get that free extra Assassinate. So I've thrown a lot at you. Let's understand the fundamentals that we're trying to do here. 1, we want to have a rotation where we have the dots on the target all the time. Your dots do a fair chunk of damage. It's like 70k damage between your 2 primary dots, and then your Eradicate is going to be doing like a quarter of your overall damage. So we want to find a way to maximize the amount of times we're using all of these dots, make sure they're not falling off on the target. So if you have any idea of what buttons to hit first, hit those 3 dot buttons first because they do a lot of damage. If you're just getting into it, you don't want to follow rotation just yet. Just make sure dots are on the target at all times. This is why the opening part of rotation is called the dots part of the rotation. As what we're going to be doing is buffing and then using all of our dot abilities. So we have 3 parts of the rotation. The first is our dots section. A dot section looks like this. First, apply Recklessness. That way we will reduce the cooldown of all of our primary abilities. Secondly, use your death field to make sure that you have all of the damage or the death marks onto the target. Then we will use both our Creeping Terror and then our discharge onto the target to make sure that we have them up and running. And then finally, we will use our Eradicate on the target to make sure that we are hitting it as often as possible and benefiting from its colossal amount of damage. So, let's walk through that one more time real quickly to make sure that we're all on the same page. In the opening part of the rotation, it is the dots part of the rotation. We will use Recklessness into Death Field, Creeping Terror, Discharge, Eradicate. This way we have our dots taking on the target and we should be ready to rock and roll, moving into the second part of the rotation, which is going to be the filler, death field, Eradicate. I think of this rotation as just like setting up to use your death field into your Eradicate again. So what do we want to be doing here? We want to reduce the cooldown of our Eradicate again, which we can use by using any melee ability. And then we want to use our death mark again, or our death field again, right before our Eradicate to make sure our Eradicate is benefiting from that extra damage, right? So the way we're going to do this is when we first open it, we have our dots on the target. If we use any melee ability, the cooldown of our Eradicate will come off cooldown and be ready for us when it's part of this rotation. And then our death field will be ready to rock and roll as well. So it's just going to look like Saber Strike, or filler, death field, Eradicate for the second part of the rotation. That way we make sure that we are using all of our death marks on our Eradicates because it's going to be doing a boatload of damage and set us up for the final part of the rotation. So let's quickly, let's quickly walk through the entire rotation one more time, or the first 2 parts of the rotation. We'll talk about the last one real quick before we practice and hopefully wrap things up. So opening part of the rotation, apply dots. Second part of the rotation, death field into Eradicate again. So let us begin. Opening, Recklessness into death field, Creeping Terror, Discharge, Eradicate. Now filler, death field, Eradicate. What we've done here is we have just consumed 2 death fields in a row full of Eradicate damage, which is pretty darn nice. We've had all of our dots taking on target this entire time, and we've set ourselves up for success going into the final phase of the rotation. This final phase of the rotation is very, very difficult. It's going to be filler, Eradicate. And what we're doing here is on the 3rd filler, our Eradicate will come back off of cooldown. So we have timed it perfectly so that way the first ability in the death field rotation will reset our Eradicate. The final ability in the second little filler, Eradicate section will also reset our Eradicate, which means we're going to be eradicating a lot during this rotation, which is great because it does a boatload of damage. So let's walk through the basics of this, then we'll talk about our fill abilities, and I just think we should be kind of done. One thing to note here is that this rotation is a little RNG dependent. We are relying on our crits to tick more and more and more to make sure that they are actually reducing the cooldown of our Recklessness. If you finish this rotation and Recklessness still has like 10 seconds ready to rock and roll, what you can do is just spam your filler abilities until Recklessness is off of cooldown. You should be at most at like 10 seconds left on Recklessness. So if you apply your Saber Strike, that's 3 strikes. That's a good chance for a bunch of crits onto the target, which should reduce the Recklessness cooldown back down to 0. So if you find yourself at the end of this little 3-block rotation with not enough crits, just get luckier, you know? That's all I can say. You just got a little unlucky. Just hit Saber Strike. You should be good to go to restart the rotation over again. So let's walk through the basics of this rotation. Actually, let's talk about our filler abilities first. Filler abilities, priority list on the filler abilities is any time that your Assassinate is glowing. That's your most important filler ability. And then any other time is use Saber Strike. That's it. If Assassinate's glowing, it's more important. Otherwise, use a Saber Strike. Unfortunately, Leeching Strike's damage isn't that impressive, and it also doesn't tick our Creeping Terror as much as our Saber Strike does. Leeching Strike is more used in Burn because it has the extra benefits of 20% extra damage in Burn. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So filler abilities, if Assassinate's glowing, use your Assassinate. If not, just hit your Saber Strike, and you should be ready to rock and roll. So let's practice this rotation a couple of times. So we're going to open up with an Eradicate because we know that Recklessness will reset the cooldown of Eradicate. And now let's go. So Death Field. Dot. Eradicate now. Filler. Death Field. Eradicate and filler. Eradicate. Begin again. Death Field. Dot section. Dot. Eradicate now. Death Field section. So filler, Death Field, Eradicate, and now filler section of turbo fillers. All the fillers in the world love to see it. Begin again. Recklessness, Death Field, Creeping Terror, Discharge, Eradicate. Now filler, Death Field, Eradicate. Now turbo filler. 1, 2, 3. Eradicate. Begin again. Death Field. Creeping Terror. Discharge. Eradicate. Set up for your Death Field. Filler. Death Field. Eradicate. Now turbo filler. 1, 2, 3. Eradicate. Begin again. Death Field. Dot. Eradicate. Set up for Death Field again. Fill. Death Field. Eradicate, and now turbo fill, Eradicate. You can see here Recklessness wasn't quite off a cooldown yet. If this happens to you, just hit Saber Strike 1 more time or 2 more times. You might get really unlucky, and then just begin the rotation again. If you can nail down this little rotation of apply your dots, set up for Death Field, fill to your heart's content, and reset, you will be perfectly fine at doing damage on Hatred. It does a lot of damage at the moment. You love to see it. Now, Hatred's damage kind of goes ballistic in Burn. We have this little benefit here of inevitable demise, which means that your dots are going to do 30% more damage to all targets under 30% health. And your Death Field too. I didn't think I mentioned that. All doing extra damage to targets under 30% health. Additionally, Leeching Strike will do 20% more damage on targets under 30% health. So if the target is sub 30, you can fill in Leeching Strike as part of your filler rotation. And that's about it. That's all that changes during Burn. It's really straightforward. It's a good spec. Very, very consistent damage. The way to spread our dots here is with our last rate. Last rate you can spam to your heart's content. If you have your dots on the target, apply our dots, and then use your last rate. It will spread your dots to all targets in the area. It's very easy to dot spread in Hatred, which is very, very nice for anyone that's playing Madness and sad that they have to dot spread once every 18 seconds. Be jealous, because Hatred is superior in this fashion. For our opener, we talked about it briefly previously. I just open with Eradicate and then begin from the dot section because as we discussed previously, Recklessness will reset the cooldown of your Eradicate. So what you can do is you can come in here and just Eradicate and then start from the beginning of Death Field dot Eradicate and fill Death Field Eradicate, and now all we do is fill 2, 3, Eradicate, begin again. If you can nail down this rotation, you will be perfectly adequate at doing damage and hatred. You will be the envy of all the inferior specs because they didn't choose to play the meta spec at the time. And that's kind of all I have to say about that. If you have any questions about playing the superior hatred spec, leave them down in the comments. I'm sure there'll be some helpful people down there who will be able to help you and answer hopefully all of your questions about your madness issues. That's kind of all I have. Oh, defensive cooldowns. Force Shroud makes you basically immune to damage for 3 seconds. It's very, very nice. Deflection increases your defense chance by 50% for 12 seconds. It's pretty nice. It's okay. Your AoE taunt or your mass mind control will decrease your damage taken by 30% for a couple seconds, which is pretty darn nice. Your taunt mind control will make a mob attack you. Do not hit this in PvE. Hit this all the time in PvP because it's going to make players do less damage. We have our cloak here, Force Cloak. It's a nice ability. Boop. Doesn't take you out of combat, but it does in PvP. They kind of bonked up the way it works now in PvE, but it's a good way to slip out of combat if you really need to. And finally, we get a free electrocute, a free stun, which is, everyone else be jealous because Sins get a stun for free. I think that's everything. Pretty sure. Oh, like and subscribe if you want to. Or don't. I'm not your mom. But if you made it this far, it appears that you like my stuff. So, if you want to see more, you totally can. Or don't. Do you. Bye-bye.